No goodbye, no warning, no explanation that ever truly satisfied the people who loved her most. For years, the name Nancy Guthrie carried a different kind of weight depending on who you asked. To her family, it meant sleepless nights and prayers that went unanswered for far too long. To investigators, it meant a file that never quite found its way to closure. To the community that surrounded her, it meant a wound, one that reopened quietly every time someone asked the question that nobody could answer. What really happened to her? Cold cases don't just sit in filing cabinets collecting dust. They live inside people. Inside the ones who waited by the phone for calls that never came. Inside the ones who drove the same roads again and again, hoping to find something, anything, that made the world feel less broken. Inside children who grew up in the shadow of an absence they could never fully explain. Inside a mother who kept her daughter's room exactly as she left it, because changing it would mean accepting something she simply refused to accept. But sometimes, years after the rest of the world has moved on, something shifts. A document surfaces. A witness finds the courage to come forward. A piece of evidence that was overlooked or misplaced or perhaps buried beneath the weight of time finds its way back into the light. That may be exactly what is happening now, because according to recent reports, fresh evidence has emerged in the Nancy Guthrie case. Evidence that investigators and her family are calling significant. Evidence that has cracked open questions many assumed would remain sealed forever. This is her story, and for the first time in a very long time, it may not be over yet. There are places in this world that hold memory differently than others. Small towns, close-knit communities where everybody knows your car, your routine, your face without needing to be introduced. Places where a missing person isn't a statistic or a headline. They're the woman who waved to you every morning at the grocery store. The neighbor whose porch light was always on, just a little longer than everyone else's. The friend whose laugh you could pick out from across a crowded room without even looking up. Nancy Guthrie was that kind of person to the people around her. By most accounts, she was warm, grounded, the kind of woman who showed up when things got hard, for her family, for the people she cared about, for the community she had been part of for most of her life. She had a life that looked ordinary from the outside, in the way that most deeply meaningful lives do. Not glamorous, not loud, but full in the ways that actually count, real in ways that don't require explanation. She had people who depended on her. She had routines that shaped her days. She had a future she was quietly, carefully building, one ordinary morning at a time. Which is exactly why her disappearance felt so violently wrong to everyone who knew her. Not just sad, not just frightening, wrong. The kind of wrong that settles into the center of your chest and refuses to leave. Because none of it fit. None of it aligned with the person they knew, the life she was building, or the way she moved through the world with such consistent, careful presence. When she vanished, the response was what you might expect. First, concern, then alarm. Then searches, interviews, the slow grinding machinery of an investigation that promised answers and, for a very long time, delivered very few. The case drew attention, locally first, then more broadly, as questions began to accumulate without resolution. Timelines that didn't line up cleanly, statements that shifted in small but significant ways, details that surfaced and made people deeply uncomfortable. And through all of it, Nancy's family remained at the center, asking the same questions over and over in different forms. Where is she? What happened? Who is responsible? For years, those questions hung in the air, unanswered. But recently, according to multiple reports, something has changed. People who have followed this case closely say the new information is not minor and not peripheral. It goes directly to the heart of what investigators have been trying to establish since the very beginning. And if it holds up, if what has reportedly surfaced is what some believe it to be, then the story of Nancy Guthrie may finally be entering its last, defining chapter. Before any of this, before the searches, the headlines, the years of heavy silence, there was just a woman living her life. Nancy Guthrie was not someone who sought attention or moved through the world loudly. People who knew her describe her as steady, dependable, the kind of person who remembered birthdays without being reminded, who checked in when you were going through something difficult without waiting to be asked, who showed up not because it was convenient, but because that was simply who she was. That's the version of her that the people closest to her still hold onto. Not the version that appeared in news reports. Not the name attached to a case number. The actual person who existed in the world before all of this. She had built something real for herself. It hadn't come without effort. Like most people, her life had its complications, its quiet seasons of struggle, its moments that were harder than they appeared from the outside. But she had navigated them with a kind of quiet resilience that people around her noticed, even if they didn't always name it. She had roots, relationships that mattered, a rhythm to her days that the people in her life knew well, and found reassuring simply because it was so consistent, which is part of what made the moment she disappeared from that rhythm so impossible to process. There was no preparation for it, no clear warning signs that anyone has been able to point to with certainty. One day she was present, fully and completely present, the way she had always been. And then she wasn't. The people closest to her have spoken over the years about the particular cruelty of that kind of loss, the kind that arrives without explanation, without a moment of understanding, without the chance to say the things that needed to be said. Grief in ordinary circumstances is devastating enough, but grief without certainty, grief that has nowhere to land because the truth hasn't arrived yet, is something of an entirely different weight. You don't get to process it in the way grief is supposed to work, because at the center of it all sits a question, a permanent, unanswerable question that reshapes every single day that follows it. For Nancy's family, that question became the defining weight of years. They lived inside it. They carried it to every interview, every meeting with investigators, every moment when someone said they had news, and the news still wasn't enough. They kept going, because that is what people do when there is simply no other choice available to them. In cases like this, the early stages of an investigation carry enormous weight that isn't always obvious at the time. What gets documented and what doesn't, which leads get prioritized and which get quietly set aside. Those decisions, made under pressure, often in the fog of early and incomplete information, can shape everything that comes after them, sometimes for years. From the beginning, there were elements of the Guthrie investigation that observers and family members found difficult to reconcile. Not necessarily evidence of deliberate failure, but gaps that were hard to explain, inconsistencies that surfaced and didn't resolve, moments where the official account and the lived experience of the people most closely involved simply didn't align in the way they should have. People who were interviewed in those early days have since spoken about feeling dismissed, about raising concerns that didn't appear to go anywhere, about providing information that seemed, from their perspective, to vanish into the process without ever producing a visible result. Investigators maintained, for their part, that all available leads were being pursued and that the case remained active. But families of missing people learn, often painfully, that an open case does not always mean an active one. And there is a difference between difficulty and diligence that people on the inside of a situation feel very clearly, even when they struggle to articulate it to those on the outside. For Nancy's family, there were specific questions they raised and specific pieces of information they believed were worth examining far more closely than they appeared to be. They continued to push, they continued to ask, and they continued, year after year, to occupy that brutal space between hope and despair that defines the existence of people waiting for answers that don't come. Then, according to reports from people close to the situation, something began to shift. Information started to emerge, quietly at first, then with increasing weight, that suggested the early investigation may have missed something significant, or that something had been there all along, waiting to be found by someone willing to look closely enough and stay long enough to see what was there. That information, according to sources, did not simply disappear. It accumulated, it connected, and eventually, it reached people who understood precisely what they were looking at. The phrase fresh evidence gets used in crime reporting in ways that can sometimes feel vague, or even routine, but it is worth pausing on what it can actually mean when it matters. It can mean a new witness who was silent for years and has finally decided to speak. It can mean a document that was overlooked, re-examined, and found to contain something that changes the picture entirely. It can mean forensic technology applied to material that was always available, but couldn't be read with precision until now. In some cases, it judging at once, which is when the weight of a cold sea means several of these things. Conveys can shift most dramatically. In the Nancy Guthrie case, the full nature of what has reportedly surfaced has not been publicly disclosed. Investigators and officials have been careful, deliberately, pointedly careful, about the language they use when speaking about it. That restraint is significant in itself. It suggests they are dealing with something they consider real, something worth protecting, something that requires the kind of careful handling reserved for material whose integrity cannot be compromised. According to reports, the new material speaks directly to questions that were central to the case from the very beginning. Questions about what happened to Nancy, precisely when it happened, and critically, whether the accounts that were given to investigators in those first crucial days and weeks actually reflected the truth of what occurred. For people who have followed this case over the years, that last point carries a particular and uncomfortable charge. The question of truthfulness, of who said what, when they said it, and whether those statements held up under scrutiny, has never fully receded into the background of this story. It has always been there, just beneath the surface. Sources familiar with the current state of the investigation have indicated, according to reports, that the evidence is being reviewed by people with the authority to act on it, that it is not being treated as a footnote or a procedural detail, that it is being taken seriously in a way that gives those closest to Nancy, her family, the people who never allowed themselves to fully stop asking, something they have not had in a very long time, a reason to believe that something might actually change. That is not a small thing. After years of silence and stagnation, the possibility of real movement, documented, consequential, irreversible movement, is almost difficult to absorb. People who have waited this long develop a kind of protective relationship with hope. They hold it at arm's length because they have learned, through experience, that it does not always survive contact with reality. But the reports continue to emerge, and the people who are in a position to assess what has actually been found have not dismissed it. That, in itself, means something. You cannot talk about this case without talking about the people who never left it. While investigators moved on to other files, and the news cycle moved on to other stories, and the world continued in its usual indifferent, relentless way, Nancy's family stayed. They stayed in the same questions. They stayed in the same grief. They stayed in a kind of suspended reality that is almost impossible to understand from the outside, unless you have lived something close to it yourself. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from waiting for justice in a case that refuses to move. It is not just emotional, though it is certainly that. It hollows something out at a deeper level. It changes the way you relate to institutions you were once raised to trust. It changes your relationship with hope in ways that are permanent, because hope that is extended over years without reward becomes something more cautious, more rationed, something you hold carefully because you cannot afford what happens when it shatters again. Nancy's family, by all accounts, never stopped advocating, never stopped asking, never allowed the case to become purely historical, a tragedy filed quietly away under the accumulated weight of passing time. They pushed when pushing was the only option. They waited when there was genuinely nothing else to do. They gave interviews and answered questions and kept the name alive in every way they could, not for attention, but because the alternative was something they could not bring themselves to choose. And now, reportedly, those years of persistent, exhausting, quietly heroic effort may be meeting something real. People close to the family have described the current moment with a kind of careful, guarded emotion that is hard to listen to without feeling something yourself. Not celebration, nothing even close to that. The relief that a family in this position might feel is not simple or clean. It carries grief inside it. It carries the weight of everything that was lost during the years the answers stayed hidden. It carries the knowledge that even if justice comes, it arrives too late to restore what was taken or return the time that was swallowed by uncertainty. But beneath all of that, there is something else, something quieter and more enduring. The recognition, after all this time, that she was not forgotten. The longer a case like this remains without resolution, the more it becomes about something larger than its original facts. It stops being simply about what happened and becomes about everything surrounding what happened. The institutions that managed the investigation, the people who were asked questions, and the people who somehow weren't. The early decisions about what to pursue, what to set aside, what to accept at face value, that determined which direction everything traveled afterward. When fresh evidence emerges years later, those layers become unavoidable, because new information doesn't only speak to what happened in the past. It raises honest, uncomfortable questions about the gap between then and now, about why, if something significant was there to be found, it took this long to find it. Those questions are not always answerable, and it would be unfair to assume the worst simply because time passed. Sometimes evidence is genuinely hard to surface until exactly the right person looks in exactly the right place. Sometimes forensic technology catches up to situations that were once beyond its reach. Sometimes a witness who stayed silent for years finally finds the courage. They didn't have at the beginning. All of those things happen in real investigations, and none of them necessarily imply anything beyond the honest difficulty of the work. But they are still questions, and in a case involving a real person, a real family, and real years of unanswered grief, they deserve to be asked without apology. According to reports, what has also emerged are indications that the new evidence connects directly to people and circumstances that were part of Nancy's world at the time she disappeared, that it is not abstract or procedural but deeply rooted in the specific reality of her life, her relationships, the events immediately surrounding her disappearance. That grounding is part of what makes it significant in a way that is difficult to dismiss. Investigators who have spent careers working cold cases often say the same thing. Evidence has a way of surfacing when the conditions are finally right. The truth, in most cases, does not disappear. It waits. It is possible, in this case, that the waiting is nearing its end. No official conclusion has been reached. No charges have been publicly confirmed at the time of this account. The matter remains under investigation, and the process, slow, careful, necessary, continues. But the direction of it feels different now, and the people who know this case from the inside seem to believe that difference is real, and that it matters. There's something that happens when a case like this begins to move again after years of complete stillness. It pulls you back to what was always at the center of it, not the headlines, not the legal proceedings, or the investigative frameworks, or the careful institutional language that accumulates around cases over time. The person. Nancy Guthrie was a person. She had a specific way of laughing that the people who loved her could still describe to you today. She had preferences and opinions, things she cared about deeply and things she couldn't be bothered with. She had a history that preceded all of this and a future she deserved to live. She had a presence in the lives of people who are still here, still waiting, still holding some version of her in the part of themselves. Where the most important things are kept, cases become cases over time. The language of investigation and documentation gradually distances us from the reality of what actually occurred, which is that a human being disappeared from the lives of people who loved her, and those people have been living inside the wreckage of that fact ever since. The emergence of new evidence does not repair that. Nothing fully does. But it matters. It matters because truth, even when it is painful, offers something that uncertainty never can. It offers the possibility of understanding, of accountability, of being able to say, finally, with certainty, this is what happened. That is not a small thing. For the people who have spent years living inside the question, it may in fact be everything. Cold cases have a way of clarifying what justice actually means. Not just a verdict, not just a sentence or a file officially closed or a news story wrapped up with a neat ending, but the recognition that a person's life, a person's absence, a person's truth deserves to be fully known, deserves to be taken seriously regardless of how much time has passed, deserves to reach the light, however long that journey takes. Nancy's family kept that belief alive through years that would have quietly broken most people. They did not accept silence as a final answer. They remained, even when remaining was the most difficult thing available to them, committed to the belief that she deserved better than an unanswered question. If what is being reported holds, if the fresh evidence is what those close to the investigation believe it to be, Then perhaps, after all this time, she is going to get it. The questions raised by this case are not entirely closed. Perhaps, in some form, they never fully will be. But the distance between where this story began and